Long before written memory, before cities had names, before borders, flags, or kings, human life followed rhythms set by land, water, and sky. Small groups moved with seasons, hunted when animals passed, gathered what the earth offered, and carried knowledge only in voice and gesture. Time was not measured in years or dynasties but in cycles of birth, growth, decay, and return. Survival depended on attentiveness, cooperation, and an intimate understanding of nature's signals. For tens of thousands of years, this way of life endured, changing slowly, shaped more by climate than by human intention. Then, across several distant regions of the world, something began to shift. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen for the same reasons everywhere. But gradually, people began to stay. Camps became villages. Villages grew into towns. Knowledge that once vanished with each generation began to settle into shared memory. Stone, clay, wood, and earth were shaped not only for tools but for permanence. The first civilizations were not born in a single moment. They emerged through countless small decisions made over centuries, driven by necessity, opportunity, and adaptation. The story of the rise and fall of the first civilizations is not a simple tale of progress followed by collapse. It is a complex human story shaped by geography, climate, belief, power, and vulnerability. It is a story of innovation and imagination, but also of fragility. These early societies achieved remarkable things with limited technology, yet many ultimately declined or disappeared, leaving behind ruins, artifacts, and unanswered questions. Their rise teaches us how civilizations begin. Their fall reminds us that no system, no matter how advanced it seems, is immune to change. The earliest civilizations formed where land and water met in predictable ways. Rivers played a central role, not because humans chose them arbitrarily, but because rivers offered reliability in an uncertain world. Seasonal flooding renewed soil, supported agriculture, and allowed food surpluses. With surplus came specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. Some could build, plan, record, or govern. Over time, this division of labor transformed social structures and reshaped human identity. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, often called Mesopotamia, some of the earliest known urban societies took shape. This region lacked natural barriers, making it both fertile and vulnerable. Early communities learned to control water through canals and levees, an achievement that required cooperation and shared planning. Agriculture flourished, and settlements grew dense. Over generations, villages merged into cities with walls, temples, and administrative centers. As these cities expanded, new challenges emerged. Managing food storage, land ownership, trade, and conflict required systems of organization beyond memory alone. Writing developed not as literature or philosophy but as accounting. Marks pressed into clay recorded grain, labor, and transactions. Over time, these symbols evolved into complex scripts capable of expressing language, law, and myth. Writing changed human society by allowing information to persist beyond a single lifetime. With writing came codified rules. Laws were no longer flexible customs but formal declarations enforced by authority. Kingship emerged as both a political and religious institution. Rulers were seen as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, responsible for maintaining order. Monumental architecture reinforced this idea. Temples and palaces dominated cityscapes, reminding inhabitants of both divine power and human hierarchy. Mesopotamian civilization was not a single empire but a shifting mosaic of city-states and kingdoms. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians rose and fell, often absorbing one another's cultures. Innovation spread through conquest and trade. Mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, and literature advanced. Yet the region's openness also meant constant warfare. Cities were frequently destroyed and rebuilt. Empires expanded rapidly and collapsed just as quickly. Environmental strain played a subtle but significant role. Intensive irrigation, while initially beneficial, gradually increased soil salinity. Crops failed, yields declined, and populations faced stress. Combined with political instability and external invasion, These pressures weakened societies over time. Mesopotamian civilization did not vanish entirely, but its centers shifted, fragmented, and transformed, leaving behind layered ruins that speak of repeated rise and decline. Along the Nile River, a different pattern emerged. Egypt's geography offered protection. Deserts bordered the fertile floodplain, limiting invasion and creating a sense of isolation. The Nile flooded predictably, depositing rich silt that renewed fields without extensive irrigation. This stability allowed Egyptian civilization to develop continuity unmatched by most early societies. Egyptian culture placed strong emphasis on order, balance, and continuity. The concept of cosmic harmony shaped religion, governance, and daily life. Pharaohs were not merely rulers but embodiments of divine order. Their authority was reinforced through ritual, symbolism, and monumental construction. The pyramids, often misunderstood as symbols of tyranny, were also expressions of collective organization, engineering knowledge, and belief in the afterlife. Writing in Egypt served not only administrative needs but spiritual ones. Hieroglyphs carried sacred meaning, and texts were believed to hold power beyond their literal content. The dead were carefully prepared for an eternal existence, reflecting a worldview deeply concerned with continuity beyond death. This focus on preservation extended to art and architecture, which remained stylistically consistent for centuries. Yet Egypt was not static. Dynasties rose and fell. Periods of strong centralized rule alternated with times of fragmentation and uncertainty. Climate fluctuations affected Nile flooding, leading to famine and unrest. Foreign powers eventually gained influence, and Egypt was repeatedly conquered by external empires. While Egyptian civilization endured for millennia, its political independence gradually eroded, and its ancient religious system faded as new beliefs spread. East of Mesopotamia and west of the Indus River, another civilization emerged that remains less understood due to the undeciphered nature of its script. The Indus Valley Civilization developed in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Its cities were carefully planned with standardized bricks, grid layouts, drainage systems, and evidence of public sanitation far ahead of their time. Unlike other early civilizations, the Indus society shows little evidence of centralized monarchy or monumental religious architecture. There are no clear palaces or grand temples. Artifacts suggest a relatively uniform culture across a wide area, implying shared standards and governance structures that were effective but subtle. Trade networks connected Indus cities with distant regions, including Mesopotamia. Despite its sophistication, the Indus civilization declined around the same time as many others. The reasons remain debated. Changes in river patterns, particularly the drying or shifting of major waterways, likely disrupted agriculture and trade. Climate change may have weakened monsoon systems. There is little evidence of violent invasion. Instead, the civilization seems to have gradually dispersed, with populations moving eastward and adapting to new conditions. The lack of written records leaves many questions unanswered. What beliefs guided these people? How were decisions made? Why did such a well-organized society not reconstitute itself in the same form? The silence of their script is one of ancient history's most enduring mysteries. Farther east, along the Yellow River in China, early agricultural communities developed independently. The river's unpredictable flooding earned it a reputation for both life-giving fertility and destructive force. Managing its waters required coordinated labor and long-term planning. Over time, this necessity contributed to the emergence of centralized authority. Chinese civilization developed a strong tradition of ancestral reverence and ritual practice. Early rulers claimed legitimacy through connection to the past and alignment with cosmic forces. Writing emerged as a means of divination and record-keeping. Oracle bones preserve some of the earliest Chinese writing, linking political authority with spiritual inquiry. Unlike many early civilizations, Chinese culture demonstrated remarkable continuity despite periods of fragmentation. Dynasties rose and fell, but core cultural concepts persisted. This resilience was partly due to adaptable governance structures and a worldview that emphasized harmony between human society and natural order. However, early Chinese states also faced internal conflict, resource strain, and external threats. In the Americas, civilization arose without influence from the Old World. In Mesoamerica, societies developed complex agricultural systems centered on maize. Olmec culture, often considered a foundational civilization, produced monumental stone heads, intricate art, and ceremonial centers. Their influence spread through trade and shared religious concepts. Later civilizations built upon these foundations. Cities grew with pyramidal structures, plazas, and calendrical systems that tracked celestial cycles. Writing and mathematics developed independently. Time was understood not as a linear progression but as a series of repeating ages. This cyclical worldview shaped religious practice and political authority. Environmental factors again played a critical role. Deforestation, soil depletion, and drought-strained agricultural systems. Combined with social upheaval and warfare, these pressures contributed to urban decline. Cities were abandoned, sometimes rapidly, leaving behind structures reclaimed by forest. In South America, Andean civilizations adapted to extreme environments. Terraced agriculture, road systems, and communal labor allowed societies to thrive at high altitudes. Although later empires are better known, earlier cultures laid the groundwork through innovation and adaptation. Their decline, like others, resulted from a combination of environmental change, internal stress, and external disruption. Across all these regions, common patterns emerge. Civilizations rise when conditions allow surplus, stability, and cooperation. They expand through innovation, trade, and organization. Over time, complexity increases. Systems become interdependent. Power concentrates. Inequality often grows. These factors can bring efficiency, but they also introduce vulnerability. Environmental change is a recurring theme. Early civilizations were closely tied to specific ecological conditions. When rivers shifted, rains failed, or soils degraded, societies faced existential challenges. Some adapted by reorganizing, others fragmented or collapsed. Human decisions often intensified these pressures. Overuse of land, deforestation, and rigid social systems reduced resilience. Political dynamics also played a role. Centralized power can coordinate large projects, but it can also suppress flexibility. When leadership fails, entire systems can unravel. Internal conflict weakens societies, making them vulnerable to external threats. Yet conquest alone rarely explains collapse. More often, invasions succeed because societies are already strained. Belief systems both supported and constrained early civilizations. Religion provided meaning, cohesion, and moral frameworks. It justified authority and motivated collective action. At the same time, rigid beliefs could resist necessary change. When realities no longer aligned with sacred narratives, legitimacy eroded. Trade connected civilizations, spreading goods, ideas, and technologies. These networks fostered growth but also dependence. Disruption of trade routes could destabilize economies. Cultural exchange enriched societies but also introduced competition and conflict. It is important to recognize that collapse is not always sudden or absolute. Many civilizations transformed rather than disappeared. People carried knowledge, traditions, and skills into new contexts. What fell were specific political structures or urban centers, not humanity itself. The notion of total collapse often reflects our focus on monumental remains rather than lived continuity. Modern interpretations of ancient civilizations are shaped by limited evidence. Archaeology provides material traces, but interpretation requires caution. Written records reflect elite perspectives. Absence of evidence does not equal absence of complexity. Many aspects of daily life, belief, and social organization remain invisible. The idea of a single cause for collapse is misleading. Civilizations are complex systems. Their rise and fall result from interacting factors over time. Climate change, resource management, political decisions, cultural values, and chance events all play roles. Understanding this complexity helps avoid simplistic narratives. There are also unanswered questions that invite careful speculation. Did some civilizations possess knowledge we do not fully understand? How did social cohesion function without apparent hierarchies? Why did certain innovations appear independently across regions? These questions remain open, framed as possibilities rather than conclusions. The first civilizations were experiments in human organization. They tested new ways of living together at scale. Some approaches proved resilient, others revealed limits. Their successes laid foundations for later societies. Their failures offer lessons about balance, adaptability, and humility. As time moved forward, later civilizations inherited both knowledge and challenges from their predecessors. Writing systems evolved. Legal codes expanded. Empires grew larger and more complex. Yet the core dynamics remained. Human societies continued to depend on environmental stability, social cooperation, and meaningful belief. Looking back at the rise and fall of the first civilizations is not an exercise in nostalgia or judgment. It is an exploration of shared human experience. These ancient societies were not primitive versions of the present. They were distinct worlds shaped by their own constraints and possibilities. Their people faced uncertainty with creativity and resilience. Their ruins remind us that permanence is an illusion. Stone crumbles, cities fade, but human capacity for adaptation endures. Each civilization contributed to a long continuum of knowledge and culture. Even in decline, they shaped what followed. In the quiet spaces between ruins, there is no final message, no moral conclusion imposed by history. There is only evidence of lives lived, choices made, and systems built in response to the world as it was known. The first civilizations rose because humans learned to cooperate at scale. They fell when conditions changed beyond their ability to adapt. What remains is not a warning or a prophecy, but a record of possibility. Human societies have always been dynamic, shaped by forces both within and beyond control. The ancient world, in its complexity and fragility, reflects patterns that continue in different forms. The rise and fall of the first civilizations is not a closed chapter, but an ongoing story, written in new ways by each generation that follows. As centuries passed and memory faded, later societies often looked back at these early civilizations with a mixture of reverence and misunderstanding. Stories became myths, and myths became symbols. Great builders were remembered as giants. Lost cities were imagined as sudden catastrophes rather than gradual transformations. Yet the archaeological record, fragmentary as it is, suggests something quieter and more human. Change unfolded slowly. Adaptation was attempted again and again. Decline was not a single event but a process that stretched across lifetimes. In many regions, the disappearance of large cities did not mean the disappearance of people. Populations dispersed into smaller communities. Knowledge of farming, craftsmanship, and social organization continued in altered forms. The visible markers of civilization, such as monuments and dense urban centers, faded first. What endured was everyday practice passed through family, ritual, and habit. From a distance of thousands of years, this continuity is easy to miss. The rhythm of rise and decline was shaped not only by material conditions but by human perception. Early civilizations developed narratives to explain their place in the world. These narratives gave meaning to suffering and success alike. Floods, droughts, and epidemics were interpreted through religious frameworks. When disasters occurred, they were often seen as moral or cosmic responses rather than environmental processes. This understanding influenced how societies responded. Sometimes it encouraged reform and humility. At other times, it reinforced rigid hierarchies and delayed adaptation. The increasing complexity of early civilizations brought remarkable achievements, but it also created fragile dependencies. Food systems relied on precise timing. Administrative systems relied on trust and record-keeping. Trade networks relied on stability across long distances. When one part of the system faltered, strain spread quickly. Resilience depended on flexibility, yet large systems often resisted change because too many structures depended on existing arrangements. One recurring pattern across early civilizations is the tension between central authority and local autonomy. Centralization allowed for large-scale projects such as irrigation, roads, and monuments. It also enabled the collection of surplus and the enforcement of order. However, as authority concentrated, decision-making became distant from local conditions. When leaders misjudged environmental or social realities, the consequences affected entire regions. In contrast, smaller communities often adapted more quickly, but lacked the resources to manage large-scale challenges. Another shared feature was social inequality. As surplus grew, so did differences in wealth and status. Elites controlled land, labor, and religious authority. Inequality did not automatically lead to collapse, but it reduced social cohesion. In times of stress, unequal societies struggled to mobilize collective effort. Archaeological evidence from multiple regions shows signs of social tension in late phases of early civilizations, including fortified settlements, weapon proliferation, and changes in burial practices. Health and disease also played a role that is difficult to trace but important to acknowledge. Dense populations living alongside domesticated animals created conditions for the spread of illness. Nutritional deficiencies emerged as diets narrowed around staple crops. Skeletal evidence reveals patterns of stress, malnutrition, and injury in urban populations that were less common among earlier foraging groups. These factors weakened communities over generations. Despite these challenges, the intellectual and cultural legacy of the first civilizations is profound. Systems of measurement, timekeeping, writing, and governance formed the basis of later developments. Mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, and medical practices were refined and transmitted across cultures. Even when political structures collapsed, knowledge often survived through adaptation and transmission. The movement of people played a crucial role in this process. Migration was not always the result of crisis. It was also a strategy for opportunity. As environments shifted, groups relocated, carrying ideas and technologies with them. These movements blurred the boundaries between civilizations and contributed to cultural continuity in unexpected ways. It is also important to recognize that our understanding of ancient civilizations continues to evolve. New discoveries challenge old assumptions. Sites once thought marginal reveal unexpected complexity. Materials once overlooked provide new insights through modern analysis. Technologies such as satellite imagery and environmental reconstruction are reshaping interpretations of how early societies functioned and why they changed. Some interpretations suggest that certain collapses were less catastrophic than previously believed. Urban centers may have been deliberately abandoned in favor of more sustainable arrangements. In this view, what appears as failure may represent strategic adaptation. This perspective does not deny hardship, but it reframes decline as transformation rather than disappearance. The emotional dimension of these transitions is harder to recover. How did people experience the slow unraveling of familiar structures? How did they interpret the loss of temples, markets, and rituals that once defined their lives? These questions remain largely unanswered, yet they remind us that collapse is lived on a human scale, not just recorded in layers of sediment. The first civilizations existed within limits they could not fully control or understand. Climate systems shifted over decades and centuries. Rivers changed course. Forests retreated. These forces interacted with human choices in complex ways. No civilization collapsed solely because of nature, nor solely because of human error. It was always the interaction between the two that determined outcomes. As later societies emerged, they inherited landscapes shaped by earlier ones. Fields had been cleared. Canals had altered water flow. Soils had been enriched or exhausted. The environmental footprint of the first civilizations influenced what was possible for those who followed. In this sense, history is cumulative, not reset by collapse. The study of early civilizations is often framed as a search for origins, but it is equally a study of endings. Not endings in the sense of disappearance, but endings of particular arrangements of power, belief, and organization. Each ending opened space for something new, even if that process involved loss and suffering. What remains striking is the consistency of certain patterns across distant regions and cultures. Independent societies responded to similar challenges in similar ways, not because of shared knowledge, but because of shared human constraints. Water, food, energy, and meaning shaped decisions everywhere. The details differed, but the underlying dynamics repeated. In reflecting on the rise and fall of the first civilizations, it becomes clear that civilization itself is not a fixed achievement. It is a process, always provisional, always dependent on balance. When balance is maintained, societies flourish. When it is lost, transformation follows. The ancient world does not speak to us in conclusions or warnings. It speaks through traces, patterns, and silences. Its message is not one of inevitability, but of complexity. Human societies have always been capable of great cooperation and great miscalculation. The first civilizations reveal both tendencies in their earliest forms. Their story continues to unfold as new evidence emerges and interpretations change. Each generation revisits the past with new questions shaped by present concerns. In doing so, the ancient world remains alive, not as a distant memory, but as an ongoing dialogue between what was, what is known, and what remains unknown. And so the rise and fall of the first civilizations remains an open narrative, shaped not only by ancient choices, but by modern understanding. It is a story without a final boundary, extending forward through time, carried by the enduring human capacity to build, to adapt, and to change. Yet even this sense of openness does not mean the narrative stretches endlessly without shape. Over very long spans of time, patterns settle into view, not as rigid laws, but as tendencies that repeat often enough to be recognizable. Human societies expand when resources align with organization, when belief supports cooperation, and when leadership responds to change with flexibility rather than force. They contract when those relationships harden, when adaptation is delayed, and when complexity outpaces understanding. In the earliest civilizations, knowledge was often accumulated through practice rather than theory. Farmers learned soil and seasons by observation. Builders learned weight and balance by failure and correction. Healers learned through trial, ritual, and inherited wisdom. This form of knowledge was powerful but vulnerable. It depended on continuity of experience. When populations were displaced or traditions disrupted, understanding could be lost within a generation. Writing reduced this vulnerability, but only partially. Written knowledge still required interpretation, education, and social stability to remain useful. Education itself became a dividing line. In many early civilizations, literacy was restricted to small groups. Scribes, priests, and administrators formed a class whose authority rested on specialized knowledge. This concentration made governance efficient, but it also created distance between decision-makers and the wider population. When crises emerged, this distance could become fatal. Policies based on tradition or ideology sometimes failed to reflect changing realities on the ground. Religious systems often mirrored this structure. Sacred knowledge was guarded and ritualized. Myths explained origins, justified hierarchy, and promised continuity beyond uncertainty. These beliefs provided comfort and cohesion, but they could also resist revision. When environmental or social conditions shifted too far from established narratives, faith in leadership weakened. Archaeological evidence suggests moments when temples were abandoned, rituals altered, or symbols defaced, hinting at deep ideological stress. The physical layout of early cities also reveals much about their priorities and vulnerabilities. Centralized storage, administrative quarters, and ceremonial spaces clustered power and resources. Defensive walls reflect both fear and confidence. Roads and canals reveal long-term planning. Yet these same structures could become liabilities. Large populations confined within walls were susceptible to disease and supply disruption. Infrastructure required constant maintenance. When labor systems failed or authority weakened, decay accelerated. Trade amplified both strength and risk. Early civilizations rarely existed in isolation. They exchanged metals, stones, textiles, food, and ideas across vast distances. These exchanges fostered innovation and prosperity. They also created dependencies. A disruption in one region could ripple outward. When trade declined due to conflict, climate shifts, or political fragmentation, economies contracted quickly. Conflict itself was a constant presence, though its role in collapse is often overstated. Warfare was common, but most early civilizations survived repeated conflicts. What changed was the capacity to recover. As systems grew more complex, recovery required more coordination and resources. A war that might once have been survivable could later trigger irreversible decline if it struck an already strained society. It is also important to recognize the role of chance. Floods arriving a year too early, droughts lasting one season longer than expected, a single failed harvest coinciding with political unrest. History is shaped not only by long-term trends but by timing. Early civilizations operated close to subsistence margins despite their sophistication. Small disruptions could cascade into major transformations. From a broader perspective, the rise of the first civilizations represents a shift in human relationship with time. Earlier societies lived primarily in the present and near future, guided by seasonal cycles. Civilization introduced long-term planning. Structures were built to last generations. Records were kept for future reference. Ancestors and descendants became part of social identity. This temporal expansion allowed remarkable achievements, but it also bound societies to decisions made long before current conditions existed. When those inherited decisions no longer fit reality, change became difficult. Irrigation systems locked communities into certain crops. Religious calendars fixed ritual obligations. Legal codes preserved outdated norms. The weight of the past could slow necessary adaptation. In this way, memory itself became both strength and constraint. The disappearance of early civilizations did not erase their influence. Later societies often settled the same regions, drawn by the same advantages. They reused foundations, repurposed canals, and built atop ruins. Sometimes they adopted older myths, reshaping them to fit new contexts. Continuity and rupture intertwined, creating layered histories that archaeologists still unravel. There is also evidence that some early civilizations consciously attempted reform in their final phases. Administrative changes, shifts in settlement patterns, and modifications to religious practice suggest awareness of crisis. These efforts were not always successful, but they demonstrate agency rather than passivity. Collapse was not simply something that happened to people. It was something they responded to with varying outcomes. The question of whether civilization inevitably leads to collapse is tempting but misleading. Early civilizations did not fail because they were civilizations. They declined because specific arrangements became unsustainable under changing conditions. Civilization itself continued, altered, and redistributed. The human capacity for organized living did not disappear. It adapted. In this sense, the first civilizations were not experiments that failed, but experiments that revealed limits. They showed how far cooperation, technology, and belief could take a society, and where those forces required balance. Later civilizations inherited these lessons, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. What we call the ancient world is not distant in essence. The same forces operate today, though at different scales and speeds. Resource management, social inequality, belief systems, and environmental change remain central challenges. The first civilizations encountered these dynamics without precedent. Their responses were shaped by their contexts, just as modern responses are shaped by ours. The study of their rise and fall does not offer simple guidance. It offers perspective. It shows that complexity brings both power and fragility. It shows that adaptability matters more than size, and balance more than dominance. It shows that human societies are processes, not permanent structures. As the traces of the first civilizations continue to weather and erode, their influence persists in less visible ways. Language structures, agricultural practices, legal concepts, and urban forms carry echoes of ancient choices. Even the idea of civilization itself is an inheritance from those early attempts to live together at scale. In the end, what remains most striking is not how these civilizations fell, but how long they endured under conditions of uncertainty. With limited technology and incomplete knowledge, they sustained complex societies for centuries and millennia. Their decline does not diminish their achievement, completes it. The rise and fall of the first civilizations is therefore not a story of loss alone, but of continuity through change. It is a reminder that human history moves not in straight lines, but in overlapping arcs, shaped by environment, imagination, and choice, unfolding slowly across time without a final conclusion. That unfolding carries forward quietly, shaped by countless decisions made far from monuments and chronicles. Long after the great cities thinned and ceremonial centers emptied, ordinary life continued. Fields were planted. Children learned skills from elders. Songs and stories shifted in form but not in purpose. What disappeared from stone did not disappear from human behavior. The habits of cooperation, memory, and adaptation that made early civilizations possible did not vanish when walls crumbled. Over long spans of time, these inherited patterns reassembled in new configurations. Smaller communities experimented again with organization, trade, and belief. Some remained decentralized, valuing flexibility over scale. Others gradually concentrated power once more, repeating cycles in altered forms. History did not reset, but it also did not repeat exactly. Each iteration carried the imprint of what had come before. One of the least visible yet most enduring legacies of the first civilizations was the transformation of landscape itself. Terraced hillsides, altered riverbanks, domesticated plants, and modified soils reshaped environments permanently. These changes influenced where later societies could thrive and where they struggled. In some regions, ancient agricultural practices enhanced fertility for centuries. In others, overuse left long-lasting scars that limited future potential. The relationship between humans and nature had shifted irreversibly. Civilization required intervention, management, and prediction. Nature was no longer only observed but controlled, at least in part. This shift brought abundance, but it also introduced new forms of risk. Dependence on managed systems reduced tolerance for variability. When control failed, consequences were magnified. Early civilizations also altered how humans understood authority. Leadership became institutional rather than situational. Power attached itself to offices, symbols, and lineages. This made coordination possible across large populations, but it also detached authority from direct accountability. Over time, legitimacy relied increasingly on tradition and ideology rather than immediate effectiveness. When institutions outlived their usefulness, replacing them became difficult. The emotional experience of living through these transitions is largely lost to us, but material traces offer hints. Changes in housing size, diet, burial practices, and artistic expression suggest shifting values and priorities. Periods of contraction often show signs of simplification rather than chaos. Tools become more utilitarian. Settlements become more dispersed. Life narrows its focus to essentials. In some cases, this simplification may have been experienced as relief rather than failure. Reduced hierarchy, smaller communities, and closer ties to land could restore forms of autonomy lost under complex systems. Not all who lived through the decline of cities would have perceived it as collapse. For many, it may have felt like a return to a more manageable scale of life. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about progress. The tendency to equate complexity with improvement obscures the trade-offs involved. Early civilizations demonstrated extraordinary ingenuity, but they also revealed the costs of sustaining large, interdependent systems. Their histories suggest that scale amplifies both success and vulnerability. Across regions, the most enduring societies were those that balanced innovation with restraint. They adjusted agricultural practices, diversified food sources, and allowed social structures to evolve. They treated tradition as a guide rather than a fixed command. Where such balance was lost, decline followed more swiftly. The silence of many ancient sites invites humility. We see outcomes but not intentions. We reconstruct patterns but not full understanding. This uncertainty is not a weakness of study but a reminder of the limits of knowledge. The past does not exist to validate present beliefs. It exists as evidence of complexity. As research continues, the story of the first civilizations becomes less about grand narratives and more about nuance. Sharp distinctions between rise and fall soften into gradients of change. Civilizations appear not as monolithic entities, but as shifting networks of people, practices, and relationships. In this view, the ancient world is not separate from the present. It is embedded within it. Modern societies still rely on surplus specialization, record-keeping, and belief systems. They still face environmental limits and social tensions. The scale is different, the technology's more advanced, but the underlying dynamics remain familiar. The first civilizations did not fail to anticipate the future. They created the future by extending the boundaries of what human societies could become. Their decline was not a negation of their achievement, but an expression of its consequences. Every new capacity introduced new dependencies. Every solution created new problems. What endures is not a warning etched in stone, but a record of possibility tested under real conditions. The rise and fall of the first civilizations reveals that human history is not driven by destiny or inevitability, but by interaction between choice and constraint. Within those boundaries, societies shape their paths, sometimes toward expansion, sometimes toward contraction, always toward change. And so the ancient world remains present, not as a lesson imposed, but as a context inherited. Its traces lie beneath cities, within languages, and inside assumptions about order and progress. The first civilizations may no longer stand, but the patterns they revealed continue to move quietly through time, shaping human experience without announcing an ending. That quiet movement through time has no clear boundary where the ancient ends and the modern begins. Instead, there is a gradual blending, where older ways dissolve into newer forms without sharp division. The first civilizations set this process in motion by changing how humans related to space, time, and one another. From that point onward, history became layered, with each generation living amid the accumulated choices of many before it. As societies rebuilt and reorganized after periods of contraction, memory played a selective role. Certain practices were preserved because they proved useful or meaningful. Others faded because they no longer fit changing realities. This selective inheritance shaped the character of later civilizations. Some emphasized law and administration. Others focused on ritual and cosmology. Still others prioritized trade and mobility. Each emphasis reflected both inherited structures and present needs. The concept of permanence itself evolved from these early experiences. Monumental architecture suggested stability and endurance, yet ruins demonstrated impermanence just as clearly. Over time, societies learned that continuity did not depend solely on stone or scale, but on adaptability. Cultural survival relied more on transmission of knowledge than on preservation of structures. Language carried much of this continuity. Even when scripts changed or were forgotten, spoken language preserved patterns of thought shaped by ancient worlds. Words related to land, authority, kinship, and belief often carried echoes of early social arrangements. Through language, the influence of the first civilizations persisted invisibly, shaping perception and behavior. Technology followed a similar path. Tools improved incrementally, but the underlying principles often remained consistent. Techniques for managing water, organizing labor, and coordinating trade evolved rather than disappeared. Later innovations were built upon foundations laid long before, even when the original context was no longer remembered. There is also evidence that the experience of collapse itself influenced later thinking. Societies that emerged after the decline of early civilizations often showed greater caution toward unchecked centralization. Myths of lost golden ages or destroyed cities appear in many cultures, suggesting a collective memory of vulnerability. These stories did not always reflect specific historical events, but they expressed awareness that complexity carries risk. The relationship between humans and the environment continued to shift. Early civilizations had already transformed landscapes extensively, and later societies inherited both benefits and limitations of those changes. In some regions, recovery was possible. In others, environmental degradation constrained development for centuries. These long-term effects remind us that human actions can outlast the societies that produce them. The study of ancient civilizations also reveals how uneven development has always been. While some regions supported dense urban populations, others maintained dispersed or mobile lifestyles. These differences were not stages of advancement, but adaptations to specific conditions. The persistence of diverse social forms challenges linear views of history. Throughout all these transformations, one constant remains visible. Human societies seek meaning as much as survival. The first civilizations invested immense effort in explaining their world through myth, ritual, and art. These expressions were not secondary to economic or political systems. They were central to cohesion and identity. When belief systems lost resonance, societies struggled to maintain unity. In periods of decline, belief often changed before structure. Rituals were modified. Symbols were reinterpreted. New ideas blended with old ones. These shifts sometimes smoothed transitions, allowing continuity under altered forms. Other times, they deepened divisions. The outcome depended on how flexible belief systems proved to be. The endurance of humanity through these cycles suggests that adaptability operates at multiple levels. Individuals adjust habits. Communities reorganize relationships. Cultures reinterpret meaning. Civilizations rise and fall, but the capacity for social learning persists. This capacity may be the most important legacy of the first civilizations. Rather than viewing ancient collapse as failure, it can be understood as part of an ongoing process of experimentation. Early societies tested boundaries of scale, control, and specialization. When limits were reached, systems changed. Knowledge gained through these experiences informed later attempts, even if indirectly. The absence of finality in this process is essential. History does not conclude with a lesson neatly delivered. It continues as an accumulation of responses to changing conditions. The first civilizations contributed to this accumulation by expanding the range of possible human organization. Their story remains incomplete not because information is missing, but because its implications continue to unfold. Each era interprets the past through its own concerns. New questions bring new insights. The ancient world shifts in meaning as the present changes. In this sense, the rise and fall of the first civilizations is not confined to antiquity. It is part of a broader human pattern that persists wherever societies grow, strain, adapt, and transform. The details vary, but the underlying dynamics endure. What remains after thousands of years is not a single narrative, but a field of traces. Ruins, texts, tools, and landscapes offer glimpses into lives shaped by ambition, uncertainty, and resilience. These traces do not instruct or warn. They simply exist, inviting careful attention. Through them, the ancient world continues to accompany the present, not as a shadow or a relic, but as a deep foundation beneath human experience. The first civilizations rose, transformed, and faded, yet the movement they began carries forward, quietly and continuously, without pause or conclusion.